you are better off investing in the SPY. I'm telling you, this week is just woo woo for me. Like woo woo. The coincidences that happens in my life, I don't even know how to explain it. Like maybe in the future I'll start a YouTube channel talking about fortune telling and the occult and the Jungian psychology. But today, let's focus on properties in London. So I was planning to produce a video comparing, is it better off for you to invest in the S&P 500 ETFs or buying a property for yourself to live in London? My hypothesis, my gut feel is it's better off for you to buy a property for you to live in London. Because, well, if you work in London, you need a place to live, right? And instead of paying rent, you're building up equity in the form of paying mortgage. And every month, mortgage is actually a false saving plan. And I'll run through some quick calculation to show you why. And a couple of days ago, I came across Diary of a CEO where Steve Bartlett interviewed one of my favorite YouTube content creator out there, Nischa. And I thought, oh, they're talking about exactly the same topic I would like to talk about. But the title of their interview was, They Are Lying to You About Real Estate. So that piqued my interest. And I thought, nah, I can't be right. So I listened to the interview and as I listen and I go, but Nisha, you're wrong because you did not talk about rent. Because if you don't own a property here in London, you need to rent and you need to take rent costs as part of the calculation, right? And I thought, no, 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 you're wrong. I'm very sure that I can prove that you are wrong. I just need to collect the data. So I did. And I spent 12 hours collecting the data because some of them, well, because the data dates back to 2015, right? So I have to track through all those old data and I have to make some assumptions because like I don't know how much rent cost in 2015. And it's very difficult to collect that sort of data. So I had to make some assumptions about what rent was like in 2015 and how much rent increased over the past 10 years. So yeah, 12 hours of just number crunching, collecting data, making assumptions. And lo and behold, I was wrong. You are better off investing in the SPY. And I'm like, damn girl, Nisha, you're right. So what I'm going to do with this video is to show you my calculations so that you can understand the method of doing a financial analysis using historical data. That's the first part of my video. The second part of my video is where I will highlight why is that the case? Because it doesn't make sense that you're building equity and yet you're losing out in the overall scheme in building personal wealth. It just doesn't make sense. So I'll highlight why and what are the factors that contribute to a better off investing in the SPY in the last 10 years. The third part of this video really is to look at the factors that we look at in the second part of the video. Do those factors still hold going forward the next 10 years? So we are going to make some predictions. And in that prediction, we'll take into consideration of macroeconomy, geopolitics, maybe even start to predict interest rate, which a lot of people love to do. I don't claim that I will be very good at doing that, but let's run some scenarios. So, are you ready to geek out on some data with me? Let's do it. Okay, scenario A. Scenario A is where we buy a property in July 2015 because we're recording this in July 2025. July 2015 is actually 11 years ago as opposed to 10 years ago, but bear with me. So you bought a property, you made an offer in July 2015, and the average price of property in London at that point is £462,097. So let's just take the average of a property in London. Assuming that you are paying 10% deposit for this property, so that comes out to £46,209.70. You also have stamp duty on top. So based on the 2015-2016 calculation, the stamp duty that you're required to pay is £13,104.83. So that's all of those data. There's also data about the interest rate at that point. I couldn't really get the month-to-month data, but I could get a 2015 mortgage interest rate data, and that is 2.8%. And I'm going to do a 5-year fix. So you renew that mortgage again in July 2020. And in July 2020, the mortgage interest rate is 2.4%. So not too far off, but actually it makes quite a big difference in your yearly total mortgage cost. It's a few £1,000s of difference just by the 0.4% difference. So you can see properties are extremely sensitive to interest rate. So that means in 2015, your cash outlay for the 10% deposit plus your stamp duty comes out to £59,314 and 53p. So that's scenario A. So in scenario A, it means every month you'll be paying mortgage, and I'll show you the mortgage calculation. But part of this mortgage also means you are paying down the money that you borrow from the bank. In this case, I'm assuming a 30-year mortgage that you bought this property when you were quite young, so the bank is happy to lend you a 30-year mortgage. Remember, in scenario A, we mentioned that your cash outlay at the initial part is £59,314 and 53p. So assuming instead of paying the deposit and stamp duty, you're using this £59,000 to invest in the SPY. Back in July 2015, that amount of money is equivalent to $91,999.80 in US dollar term. With that money, you can buy 525 and 95 units of SPY ETF shares. So that's our basis. You also need to pay rent. So I couldn't really get a rent data in London because, as you can imagine, rent varies a lot, right? You can rent a studio apartment for, I don't know, maybe £1,500, and you can also rent a 3-bedroom apartment somewhere really nice for, I don't know, £20,000. So let's just assume in this case that rent is equivalent to 5% of the property cost. Before you start to criticize me, I have done a sensitivity data. Stay till the end of the video and you can know, even if I do the maximum sensitivity data where your rent increased by a lot, you're still better off investing in the SPY. So we have set up the scene. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. So in scenario A, where you buy a property, you also need to budget 1% of the property cost as your maintenance. So maintenance would mean things such as your service charge and also the wear and tear of the house that you need to, pay for. For example, renovating your bathroom and kitchen every 10 years, for example. So we set up the scene. Scenario A, buying a property, and scenario B, investing in SPY. Let's go through the numbers in detail. So I'm going to input all my data in scenario 1, just like what we have described. Property price, deposit, and also stamp duty. The stamp duty calculation is taken from this website here, which I can include in the link below. And basically is this much. The first £250,000 is a certain amount, and then the next £250,000 is the next amount up to £500,000 is 5% stamp duty. So this is the number. Interest rate of 2.8% in 2015 and interest rate of 2.4% in 2020 when we need to renew for another 5-year fix. What I have done, and I created this table a long time ago when I first bought my property, actually in Singapore, but the formula stays the same, it's just the interest rate changes, is a table that calculates how much monthly mortgage is going to cost me and how much money I'm forced to save every month. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So the property price, mortgage of 30 years, and 2.8% interest for a 5-year fix. This is where the magic happens. I know it can look a little bit overwhelming, but bear with me a little bit. So the loan amount that you are borrowing from the bank, remember we are paying 10% deposit, so you are borrowing £415,887 from the bank. And again, this is the data from the previous page. I basically just inputted it. So on a monthly basis, you end up paying £1,708 and 86p for your mortgage payment. But out of that £1,700, £740 is your principal repayment. Remember, we're borrowing £415,887 from the bank. Every month, you're reducing the amount by approximately £700 at the start of the mortgage period. So at the end of that 30-year term, this amount becomes zero and the whole property belongs to you instead of, legally speaking, the bank. And so on the yearly basis, you will end up saving £8,900. This is what I mean. Mortgage payment is a forced saving plan because you are working towards paying off the £400,000. So when you compare whether is it better for you to buy a property in London or invest in SPY, you need to take this forced saving plan into the consideration because you are building your net worth and you're building your wealth through that. So let's go back to this Google sheet here. So the first year you end up paying, this is the loan amount that you're paying, multiply that by 12. And then we are also assuming that you are paying 1% of the property price in maintaining the property. And this includes service charge and ground rent if that's applicable. And obviously maintenance of your own home. For example, every 10 years, you might want to do a bathroom and kitchen fit out again, or maybe painting the wall every 5 years. So these are all captured in that 1%. Of course, I'm making a pretty big assumption here. So the equity build up is what we just extracted from the previous table right here. So £8,900, so you build out the equity. So it's important for us to calculate that. So that's scenario one. What I'm also doing, because our fixed interest rate of 2.8% is only valid until 2020, and Google Sheet is not very good with calculating variable interest rate. It's actually very, very clunky. So what I did was I go up to month 60, which is at the end of year 5, and the loan outstanding is £368, sorry, 368,387.96 pounds. So I'll use that figure, 368,387.96, and I input that back into this sheet and then reduce this to 25 years. This is how I calculate that. So you kind of think about it as if you're getting a new mortgage every 5 years at the end of that fixed term. So let's do that. So you input the new mortgage with the new outstanding loan, and then you change the terms to 25 years because 5 years has passed, and you change this to 2.4%. And you also need to change this to 0 because in this case, you are borrowing this full amount of money from the bank in that second term of 5 years. So you can see the monthly payment, because the interest rate has dropped 0.4%, the monthly payment dropped to £1,634.16. So then we use this data to input it into the first graph so that we can calculate how much repayment we're paying every month. So with that, we go back to the first graph, the first table, and input the data of how much mortgage payment we're paying every month. So remember, we're paying £1,634.12 every month for 12 months, and then we also need to put in 1% of the property price as a maintenance cost. So in this case, I'm just assuming that the property price stays more or less the same in the past 10 years, which is actually quite a legitimate assumption, which we'll see later in the land registry data. So this means every month, the cash flow, the cash outflow of living in that property is about £24,000. And with that, it also means you're building up about £10,000 of equity every year, between 10 to about £12,000 every year. Again, you can see that as the year goes on, you are building more and more equity. And, you know, the first year you're only building about £9,000 of equity, but towards the end you're building, towards the end of the 10 years, you're building a £12,000 worth of equity. So this is how much that's going to cost you to live in that property. Scenario B is where we use the £59,000 and put it in an S&P 500. So in scenario B, we are assuming that you are investing this money in S&P 500, and then you need to pay rent of 5% of the average London property price every year. So this is where I will go back to this website here, and I extracted the housing price for London in July every year. So that's kind of how I standardize all my data. So let's just change this back to 2015 because that's when we start our experiment. So you can see that between 2015 and 2025, London housing prices hasn't increased that much, and the average stays quite stagnant. So I take the July figure every year and then multiply that by 5% to assume that this is the rent you'll be paying. I know some people will argue, they say, no, there's no way you can rent a £460,000 property at, £2,000 every month. Bear with me a little bit because I could easily change this data and multiply that by 20% to sort of test the sensitivity and test the maximum range of my assumption and the minimum range of my assumption. So this is what you will do with SPY. And in this case, with SPY, yes, with SPY, at £59,000 in 2015, that's equivalent to 91,999 US dollar, and that's equivalent to this 525 units of SPY. And then I also did a calculation comparing which one has more cash flow. So is your rent more expensive than your mortgage, or is your mortgage more expensive than your rent? Because if I'm assuming that, let's say, if you look at the first year here, my mortgage payment plus maintenance cost is £25,000, whereas my rent is only £23,000. I have £2,000 left over, and with that leftover money, I can invest it in S&P 500. So based on the July 2016 data, I can buy about 14 units of SPY ETF. So I basically add that in. So let's do the same for property. So I effectively created this table, and then actually for 2017 onward, which is the second year onward, you have more money when you buy your own property, which you can then divert this extra money into SPY 500, S&P 500 shares. So I basically repeat all of that, and you arrive at the data where at the end of 2025, you will end up, if you buy your own property, you end up with 55 shares of SPY, whereas when you invested in SPY using the deposit and the stamp duty, you will end up with 14, so 525 plus 14 shares, so you end up with 540 shares of SPY ETF. So, and I also use that data to calculate how much is that equivalent to US dollar, and then convert that back to British pound. So purely in terms of the number of SPY shares you hold, if you never buy your own property, you end up with an equivalent of £458,100 worth of SPY shares and £47,000 of SPY shares. But you also have your property to speak of, right, in this case. So let's look at how much money you would have paid, how much equity you would have built up if you were to buy your own property. You would have built up slightly over £100,000 of equity in your own home. And we also look at what's the average property price in 2025, right? Because we bought an average property in 2015. So let's just assume the average property is worth £565,670, £637, which is what we input here. So now we can calculate because we have all the data. So the increase, when you think about how much net worth you have by making these two different decisions, in the first case of buying your own property, you end up with, in scenario A, you actually end up with a negative net worth. Because even though your property price has increased by a little bit, increased by about £100,000, and you have built up an equity of about £100,000, all of that is being eaten away by your mortgage payment and the maintenance costs. So you end up with a negative net worth of £38,000. Whereas if you were to invest in it SPY 500, you end up with £450,000 of shares, and you would have end up paying about £263,000 of rent, which is still a little bit more than your mortgage payment. But because the increase in value in SPY 500 is so much that you ended up with a net worth of close to £200,000. This seriously was the shocker for me. I wasn't expecting myself to be wrong and Nischa to be right, but when I look at the numbers, literally, I nearly fell off my chair. I just thought, oh my goodness. And when you look at the difference between these two, we are talking about a difference of £233,000 just by making the decision differently 10 years ago. So I am still in shock, even though I've done this calculation so many times just to make sure I get the numbers right. give me a moment to recover from my shock, and I'll move on to the second part of this video. So I am still in shock. I thought, could I have made a mistake in my calculation, in my interest rate, in the way I extracted my data? And what about testing some of the assumptions so that my hypothesis could hold? So I was going into a phase where I was trying to massage the figure to make my hypothesis hold, which is not healthy. And I thought, okay, one place where my hypothesis could really be wrong is the rent. Some people would criticize me. They say, well, the rent is not that cheap in London. There's no way you can rent a £450,000 property on only £200,000 per month rent. And I go, okay, I totally support that assumption. I support that criticism. So what I did was, okay, let's increase the rent by 20%, right? So this is what I did. Let's increase it by 20%. And even then, you are still better off by £180,000. Trust me, I tried all sorts of ways. I combed through my data 4-5 times and I go, where else could I have potentially made the mistake? Or what about assumptions that are wrong? And there is just no way, no matter how I massage my figure, buying a property is better than investing in SPY. You are just better investing in SPY and rent. And once I recovered from my shock, I thought, let's examine why, right? So I look at the housing data again. And what happened with the housing data is, when you look at the housing data from 2015 to now, you realize property prices in London hasn't increased that much. And that's one reason why. But you kind of go, so why is it that back in the 90s, people always say it's better off to buy property? Well, it's because things are different in the 90s. Let's go back to 1995. So let's just assume you were eligible to buy a place back then. In 1995, the average house in London, the average property in London is about £81,000. This is nothing. You can't even pay deposit with £81,000 with some properties. And fast forward to 2015, you notice that the average housing price is about £400,000. Remember, if your property is £81,000 and you do 10% deposit, that's only £8,000. You're borrowing about £72,000 from the bank. 20 years on, fast forward to 2015, you would have, let's say, assume you have paid down half of your mortgage. So let's say you have built up about £30,000 of equity. Let's just assume that way, right? I think I need to run through the numbers, but let's just do a very high level assumption. So you would have still owned the bank about £30,000, but your property would have been worth about 400, let's assume £450,000, right? So out of that £450,000, £30,000 is belongs to the bank. So you are taking home about £420,000. Remember, your deposit was only £8,000. That means a 50 times increase of your deposit that you have paid for. That's equivalent to about 20 to 22% compound every year. And there's just no way that SPY can give you that kind of return back in 1995, which is why back in 1995 it's better off for you to buy a property. But when the property prices stays flat, like what we have seen between 2015 to 2025, you're not building net worth. You're not building capital gain in your property, which is why buying SPY is better. Then I started looking at exchange rate, because British pound in the past 30 years has actually been very volatile for a major currency. And then I used this graph, and then you realize actually back in 2015, British pound was worth 1.56 US dollar, and it has dropped. I mean, it has ebb and flow quite a lot, and then on this side, it has dropped to about 1.34 US dollars. So it has depreciated by about 10%. Which is also why when you're buying SPY, you are hedging against the drop of British pound. So that's another way how you can build wealth. You're effectively betting that UK is not doing very well. Unfortunately, I don't have a longer data from XE. I can probably get it from somewhere else. But the third factor, let's also look at how SPY has performed in the past 10 years. And this is the maximum data we can get. So it's almost 30 years, but let's only focus on the last 10 years, which is 2016 to now. So when you look at 2016, let's just calculate this. So from 2016 to now, SPY has increased by about 2.8 times. So it has been up by 180%. 2.8 times, that's equivalent to about 10% a year, compound over 10 years. So, and then when you go back to the housing prices, you realize housing prices has not grown 10% even over the 10 years, right? So, well, actually it's grown by about 20% over 10 years, but not on a year-to-year basis, whereas SPY is increasing at about 10% per year since 2015. So that these three factors really explain why, if you have the foresight back in 2015, you're better off investing in SPY and just renting. I'm still in shock, but the fact is the fact. The numbers don't lie. And then I started thinking to myself, what about going forward? Would these three factors still hold? The first question I asked is, where would property price in London go in the next 10 years? Would it be up by a lot, down by a lot, or stay the same? The second question I asked is, where would GBP go? Where would British pound relative to US dollar perform? Would it drop further or would it increase? And the third question I asked is, how would SPY perform going forward the next 10 years? So this is my personal speculation. And if you have any thoughts about these three factors, I would love to hear your comments, especially if you're from the finance industry. My personal opinion is that the housing prices are likely going to stay at best flat for the next 2 years, at worst drop slightly. It's a lot more difficult to predict the 10-year trend of housing prices. But I do know that housing prices is heavily correlated to interest rate, and I personally think that interest rate is going to be volatile in the next 10 years. We have already started seeing this since about 3 years ago with the Russian-Ukraine war. The reason why I think interest rate is going to be volatile is because interest rate is determined by inflation. Shouldn't be that way, but that's how the capitalist world works. The interest rate is determined by inflation, and I think inflation is going to be volatile because of geopolitics instability, which we have started to see from 3 years ago. Every time when there is a geopolitical instability, chances are oil prices is going to be affected, and oil and gas prices is pretty much the input to everything we see: energy, transport, groceries, food, you name it. So we are going to see volatility in inflation and hence interest rate and hence the housing prices. So that's the first factor. So the next factor is, where do I think British pound GBP will perform against US dollar? I personally am not very positive on British pound. Just the way the government is being run. We haven't been investing a lot of money in infrastructure. The productivity hasn't increased that much in the last 10 years, and I'm not that positive it will increase in the next 10 years against the Americans. But the thing is, it's a funny one, because when you talk about currency comes in a pair. So in this pair, we're talking about British pound GBP against US dollar USD. Do I think that US dollar will perform well in the next 10 years? I'm not very positive either. I suspect, well, because right now US dollar is the reserve currency, and whenever you do global trade, it is denominated in US dollar. Is that going to be the case going forward, or are we going to see some politicians or analysts call it a multimodal society, meaning the significance and importance of US dollar will drop. Is it going to be in Chinese yen? Is it going to be euro? Is it going to be Japanese yen? We don't know. I think Japanese yen, Japan is probably too small of a trade country to have any influence and to have trade denominated in Japanese yen. But euro could be a good contender, right? So euro might see a resurgence because of that, but even then I'm not very, very convinced. So the last question I'm asking is, how would SPY perform going forward the next 10 years? SPY performed really well in the last 10 years, mainly because of Mac 7, so the Microsoft, the FANG stocks, and all that. Are they going to continue to do well in the next 10 years? Quite likely, but will we see the sort of performance we did from 10 years ago where they're effectively growing at about 10% per year? Maybe not. Uh, so when you combine all of that together, and if you ask me, so Vivian, what's the conclusion? It's so difficult to make that prediction. And in one of my videos, I mentioned if you're buying a house, if you're buying a property in the UK for your own use, for yourself to live in, and you're reasonably certain that you're going to live in that property for at least 5 years, that's still a pretty good deal. In that it gives you stability in life. You don't have to worry when would the landlord want to sell the flat or rent it out to other people, or his sister wants to move in and has to kick you out. So having your own home to live in whichever part of UK you're in provides that stability. But if you are okay renting, would you be better off investing in SPY or another equivalent shares? For example, let's say a Chinese ETF. I don't know. I really don't know. I think going forward the next 10 years, I personally think Chinese or Indian ETF might have a pretty good chance to perform as well as SPY, if not better. So it is a very hard prediction, and I think everybody has their own opinion, uh, and nobody can be 100% right, and I'm fully aware of that. So kind of painted myself into a corner with this video, didn't I? Um, but yeah, definitely food for thought, and I would love to hear your opinion in the comment section. I'm crowdsourcing opinions, so especially if you are an expert in geopolitics, in history, in finance, leave it in a comment below. And if you like this YouTube video, please click a like and a subscribe. And as a new YouTuber, I really appreciate every like and every new subscriber. It just puts a smile on my face. So yeah, I'll see you again very soon. Bye.